In this video, I'm going to be giving very specific tips on how I texture organics. This is my own way of texturing. That's not to say it's the one and only way to do it, but I hope you find these tips helpful. I would say the texturing inside Minecraft involves two things: the form of the build and the colors used. So I'm going to give some examples of how to use the form and color in different ways to achieve different types of textures. In this video, I'm specifically going over how to make something look furry, feathery, or scaly, but there may be some other tips mixed in. A lot of times when people think of texturing, the first thing they think of is, oh, the colors used or the color palette. I think it's not just the colors, but the form underneath is just as important. It's both the form and the colors combined that make the build look completed and three-dimensional. So here is a wolf that I had done before. I went ahead and just turned half of it white so we could see the underlying form. And this was my first time ever attempting to do fur. And really, because this is such a small scale, that is why I kept it very, very smooth. And I thought, because I'm going to be having a lot of detail, or I wanted to have more detail with the colors, I didn't want the form here to be too crazy. And because of the scale of this build, because it's not the biggest organic ever, it's kind of hard to get the kind of detail that would be necessary if I wanted to make this more jagged, let's say, make it look more furry just with the form itself. It probably would not look very good just because of the scale of it. I'm not going to cover how to texture every little thing on this wolf. We're just going to focus on the furry aspect of it. The first step when it comes to texturing, well, of course, I already talked about it kind of, is the form. So once you get the form down, the next thing you gotta do is figure out what colors you want to use. I used 3 different grays, 1 brown, and 2 cream colors, and the glass over here is the special block. That's what I used to help me create the illusion of fur. The first thing I did was lay down the colors just flat on this form. So you see how some of these colors are all blended in? There's no right or wrong way to really lay down the colors. It just depends on what you want to do. I'm going to start with the lightest one, and we're just going to do the grays first. I'm just going to do this with Go Paint to make it easier. We'll just pick a random brush size. So let's just say if I'm laying down my first layer of color, it's going to be something like this, right? And I'm not going to do the whole thing. We'll just do a big example here along the back. Again, I don't remember how I did this exactly the first time, so I'm kind of making this up on the spot. But for the most part, most of this texturing is just done by laying down the colors straight onto the form that I already had existing. So I'm going to take this light gray concrete, maybe the acacia wood. I am also thinking about a gradient pattern going from light to dark, but with this wolf, they have a lot of different colors mixed in together, almost speckled like. So you don't want it to be a perfect gradient when it comes to something like that. If you want to achieve a little bit of a speckled look, maybe I'll make the fall off greater and I'll just, put a little bit on, maybe not covering every single space. And then I'll just gradually lay more and more on top. Yeah, this is the general idea I think that I did. I just kind of layered the different colors until it looked kind of speckly. I was trying to achieve just the color of fur. The tricky part is once I did that, it still looks too flat because the form is very flat and I don't really want to adjust it because of the size of this organic. I needed to come up with some kind of solution to create some volume to this texture. And that's when I had the idea to add the glass. So if you look at the glass texture from the side here, what it's doing is it's softening that edge. It doesn't have as harsh of an edge. It's making the whole thing lighter and look, I guess, a little fluffier. That was my thought process going into this. So that is what I tried to do on this wolf. You can see I didn't put it everywhere though. I put some glass here along the top edge. I put some here along this edge. I only put it in places where you could really tell that the fur is sticking out. So I only put it here, I put it along the top, and then I put it right here along the side and down here. I just did it in lines. I didn't put it everywhere because if I put it everywhere, it would have covered up all of these other colors that I wanted to be visible. So I just put it in key spots where I think the fur really needed to stand out, especially when you're looking at it from a distance or whatever angle you're looking at it from. You want to be able to see those softer edges. That's basically all there was to this particular build. And there is a lot of hand texturing involved when it comes to fine-tuning stuff. I mean, right now I just showed you an example of the back, but a lot of this is done like I would texture anything else. So when it comes to the lighter parts of the fur, I didn't do anything special for those. It's just the bone block. And then the mushroom stem block is the shadowy or darker areas of the fur. But as far as making it look softer and fluffier, I didn't really do that for those parts. Really, I only used the glass to achieve that look. And I think it looks pretty okay for this scale. This method of texturing fur relies mostly on the colors you're using and the placement of the glass, but you can use the underlying form too to help create shapes of the texture itself. This is too small of a scale for me to do that, but if I were building it much larger, I could possibly build little tufts of hair to make it look fluffy. But that's not always necessary because the fur is short. However, in the next example I'm about to show you, we will put a lot more emphasis on the underlying forms. Here we have a half-completed snowy owl. With feathers, it's very different. No matter what scale I build at, I want those feathers to already be defined through the form before even moving on to texturing. It is very important that your feathers don't look flat, or that wings as a whole don't look like a flat sheet of paper. As you can see, half of this owl is not done at all because I'm going to show you how I go about creating this form of these feathers, and then the coloring is really just helping reinforce those shapes that we've laid down. I'm going to build out this wing real quick and just give you some tips on how to shape it, because shaping with feathers is the more important stage. I usually start by having the wing shape figured out, at least the bone structure of where that's going to go, but then we can build off of that using the loft tool. And I just start with the basic wing shape first, the bigger overall shape of the wing, and this can be done in little segments too, but what I usually do is start with this bigger shape and then just gradually build onto it the individual feathers. It can be a very slow process, but I think it's very much worth it. Now it is much harder to match a wing that you already have built, so I might not get this exactly right, but I'm going to do this as an example. What a lot of people might do if they get one wing built out is they might get lazy and then decide to just copy and flip the existing wing, but I don't like to do that if I can help it. If it's something smaller like this, I don't mind building it out again. Sometimes I do that technique, but it really just depends on how symmetrical I want my build to look. Sometimes I like the asymmetrical look, so I'll build them out individually. Anyway, that wasn't really what this video is about. I'm just rambling as I build my wing. So here I started with just the top half, just the basic shape, and I'm going to do the same for the bottom. We just want to figure out the angles that it's going and all of that. And for this one, it might be better for me to build up my frames going downward like this. I'm not sure. I need to look at what I did on the other side because I forget. Normally I would be looking up a reference or seeing how to do it, but right now I'm basing it off of my other wing that was based off of a reference. So let's go ahead and set that. And you can see there's some things that aren't the same. This one goes out wider. This part isn't connected straight to the body, but that's okay. The whole idea of this is just to get the basic layout done. Then usually what I'll do is I'll take the loft tool again and go through and add individual feathers. Using the loft tool is more helpful with larger organics. Typically, if it's a smaller organic, I just do everything by hand. It's naturally a lot slower to do everything by hand, but I like having that sort of precision when building out the feathers. Tools are beneficial to get yourself started quicker, but all the refining is best done by hand. What I'm going to do is go through all of this and slowly work through texturing it. Maybe I'll do a little time lapse just so you can see the process a little more, but that's basically all I'm doing, what I just showed you. I'm using the loft to create individual feathers, or I'm just building them by hand. A lot of times that just takes practice knowing how to angle the feathers, and also, like I said, looking up references for how to do that. My biggest tip for feathers is that they should look like feathers before any coloring is done. Here's the full time lapse of me building out one wing, just trying to get the shapes correct. I was not looking at a reference while doing this, so it could have been improved much more if I were. I was actually just looking at my other wing and trying to make it look good based on that. For most wings, it is more important to get the front done, but it's also a good idea to make sure the back looks nice. At least that's the case for all of my builds, because I like to make sure everything looks good from any angle. That took me about 50 minutes to shape that wing, not as long as I thought it would take, but so that's really not that bad just to shape the feathers. Now, I do like the shape of this wing more than this one, but to be honest, I was just winging it for this tutorial. You can see the basic idea. I still like the shape of this one. This one doesn't have nearly as many feathers as this one, but I just wanted to get the point across that shaping the feathers almost does all of the work for you. You can see the colored versus the non-colored. There's not too much different about them because the shapes create natural shadows and highlights for you. But we are going to additionally texture it with some added color just to add to those shapes even more and just to help define them more, like you see over here. These are all the colors that I've used over here. I have a lot of different whites, a couple grays, some dark grays. The dark grays are really more for these dark speckled spots that you would see on a snowy owl, and there's also some on the tips of some of the feathers. I did look at a picture to help me texture this. So the general idea is that you'll take the darker blocks, put them in the darker areas, in the shadowy parts of the feathers, and then gradually work your way up to the lighter blocks, which will be the highlights for the feathers. So I usually start by doing a basic gradient. So I'm going to keep all of these tips as wool, but just focus on making it gradually get darker toward this edge, toward this inside edge of the wing. So I'm going to lay down just a middle tone somewhere in between the gradients. This is calcite. I think it's somewhere in the middle of that color palette. But then once I have that laid out, I just kind of do this part very sloppily. Then I'm going to take some polished diorite and put that as the next layer on top of the calcite. And this is really messy, but I'm going to go in and hand color it too, hand paint it all. Now I'm going to take some smooth stone, make a very small brush, maybe a little bit bigger, and just go, I'm going to disable the mask, and then go around these edges. Not too much, because once it gets this dark, I don't need nearly as much of this. I can even take this down to just a single block of a brush and maybe just paint the darker areas with this. This can be just as slow of a process as the shaping part. As you can see already, it's really just continuing to define those shapes that we started out with. So really, feathers is a joint effort of the shape and the color. The brightest white block that you can get is snow, so I'm going to be putting it on the top edges of a lot of the feathers and gradually work my way down. It may be a very slow process doing this one block at a time, but it's a lot cleaner to do it that way, and it just avoids any mistakes that are more likely to happen with a larger brush size. It's nice to be precise. And if I want to go in and quickly change a color, I usually like to use the replace brush, so it's just /repl1. Even when hand painting, I do prefer to use a tool of some kind, even if I'm just painting one block at a time. I just like having that ability to undo. It's pretty easy to know where to put the colors when you have a good understanding of the highlights and shadows and where those would land on the shape. I'm not going to go through the trouble of texturing this entire wing to perfection, but if I go over here and look at this one, you can see how this middle area here is all very gray. There's almost no white in it whatsoever. And then all of the white over here, it stands out much more, it's much brighter. And then there's some bright whites here. I was looking at a reference when texturing this, and that did help a lot with where the gray patches should go. But it's okay to have a big dark shadowy spot like that. It doesn't have to be highlight shadow block on every single feather. It's nice to have it break up so that you have the bright parts here, bright parts there, but if you had everything evenly textured the same, it's gonna look very flat just to have a repetitive thing going all the way through the whole wing. So I need to work on this wing more. This wing does not look as good as this first one, but you're getting a general idea. You can see how there's just some white in some places. The middle part can be left gray. You just have to develop an eye for this. And it's not something that can come quickly or easily necessarily. It just comes with practice, and your own judgment just kind of develops over time and how you perceive things. For the rest of the bird, it's pretty much the same process as anything else. You'd think about the shadows and highlights, and then right here, because this is such a very tiny detail of the speckled feathers, you have to very carefully texture that. I made sure that none of those black blocks are touching each other and that there was always a neighboring darker gray block. I say it's dark gray. It's darker than the whites around it. So you just want to make sure they're transitioning nicely into the white and having some white mixed in. The bottom line is it takes a lot of patience and practice, and the form is very, very important here. Last but not least, I'm going to give you some tips for how to do scales, and yes, I built this entire dragon just so I could show you how to do scales, and I'm actually really proud of him. I think he's really cute, despite me being very rushed in trying to build him. But anyway, I wanted to talk about the scales on this. The texturing is the same process as the other two with the fur and feathers. It's just kind of a combination of the two. So for this one, let's go to the other side, and you can see the base form. It's very smooth and very flat. I didn't take much time in adding extra bumps or anything like we did on the feathers. However, over here, this is the only section where I did carve into the shape a little more, right along wherever the belly is and these ridges that go across. I did try texturing it without those ridges and just flat, and it didn't look very good. Here you can see how it looks from this side with those ridges. You get a little bit of extra depth to it by having those cutout shapes, so it is essential there, I believe. But that's just one of those things you also have to just experiment with and figure out as you go. Originally, I didn't have those cut out, and then I added that little cutout because it ended up looking much better. But I did start out having everything very, very smooth, but then you can use the coloring on this to create that sense of depth and scale. That pun was not intended. This did take a while, but I can at least talk through some general ways to go about creating these scales. First of all, naturally, we have our color palettes. I have one red palette and one brown palette for the belly and for the body. There is separate color palettes used for other things like the horns and the wings themselves, but those were textured slightly differently. Maybe I can go over them briefly, but the main thing I wanted to cover was the scales. I textured the other side almost entirely by hand, and when I say by hand, it more or less means one block at a time. Now there are some times where I'll do more than one block at a time, but most of the time it's done by painting one block at a time using commands. So it's just very, very slow and meticulous, but I think it's worth it. So I started by taking the second darkest block, so the crimson hyphae, and just drawing the scales. Not all of them, but I started just a little section of them and trying to make sure they are overlapping. So this one goes like this, so I'm going to have two go on top of there. I do need to double check and see how big I made these scales on this side. I guess that is something that's going to be a little bit trickier since I did do one side that I don't know exactly how big to make these scales, but I can keep adjusting it as needed. I started with something like this, and then I took the next block color, which would be the concrete. Actually, I could probably even just take the concrete and paint over everything. So just paint over a lot of this, figuring out where the red parts are going to go, because this part is all going to be brown eventually. So I think this is how I did actually start the other side. I started by painting the red first. Let's just do a little section like this. You figure out where you want the red part to go. And then I took the crimson hyphae and painted over the scales on that. But once I have that, that's my medium color, right? Then I can take the wool and the glazed terracotta. Those are my highlights. And this just involves a lot of trial and error. So I have the red wool, then I can put some lighter blocks along the edge. And depending on where you put these highlight blocks, the brightest blocks, it's going to change how the scale looks. And I don't have a good way of describing it other than just experimenting. Here you can already see it's starting to look like individual scales. And it's really all the colors here that are making it look like that, because you saw the original shape of the dragon is very flat and smooth. So we're using color here to really create that illusion of depth that we can't really get through the shape. If you had built a dragon at a very large scale, a very enormous sized dragon, then maybe you could actually build the depth through the form, like cut out all of the deeper sections of the scales. But because this dragon is just not big enough for that, it would look really funny if I did that on here. I think using the color to create that sense of depth is enough. And it just takes a lot of tweaking and a lot of patience. I spent a good number of hours working on that first half of the dragon, and a lot of it was done just like this, just going in and hand painting everything. This was just how I got it started. And then once I got more of it laid down, I could get an overall picture and come back and look at it and then tweak some more things. You'll see this is looking like scales already, but it all looks very much the same, especially with the dark sections. It's all looking very copy-pasted, if you will. It just looks very repetitive, and it doesn't look like the form of the dragon itself is having any influence on this. It just looks like a flat texture. I don't know how to describe it. It does look flat. It looks textured but flat. Because if you look at this side, you'll see that I mixed in some of the netherwort block. I put this in place of some of the crimson hyphae. So once I had more of this laid out, I just took a brush and put the netherwort on it, put it on top of the crimson hyphae, maybe make it a little bit bigger of a brush. Actually, it would be smaller. And once I had more of those built out, I just took this and went over some of those edges just to add additional forms to it. You can see already that looks so much different. You're getting a lighter edge on this side, darker edge on this side, and the nether bricks also is an important part of this because this is the darkest block, and I made sure to use that to accentuate all of the darker areas. First, I used it to help the neck stand out from the rest of the body, and I can go in here and, extend it if I need to. But then the crimson hyphae also goes in here. But I can take this and just put a few of them in between here as well. Maybe I have to go on top of the crimson hyphae because some of these scales are kind of small. But just adding a few dark blocks in some of the corner spots or areas where you think there would be a lot more depth inside the scale. Something I do try to avoid is these big clusters of dark spots. I try to make sure it still consistently looks like a scale shape. Maybe putting some more of this in there. If you look at this side that I already did, something else that I used to my advantage is not every scale is textured the same way. Some of them have a lot more highlight blocks than others. The more highlights that are on a scale, the brighter the scale will look overall. And then these scales that are closer to the middle in the darker areas, some of them have only one or no highlight blocks on them at all, because I'm thinking about making a gradient of scales as well as a gradient within each scale, if that makes sense. So we want these scales along the edge to be darker. We want these scales along here to be brighter. And that's why I've been putting the nether wart block along here to make those ones just look a little brighter. Now, once we get to the body of the dragon, that's where it got a bit trickier and it doesn't look as clean. I tried my best to make it look very clean. Something I found that worked really well when it came to these smaller areas like the tail and around the belly area was I tried to make the scales also go from a normal size that are overlapping to where they're more separated and getting smaller and then eventually going into nothing. So I want them to fade away into nothing neatly. I don't know if I explained that very well, but that is what I was going for there. I think overall the best thing that you can do for scales is to take it slow, do it very gradually, just work on one type of thing at a time. Maybe for the first round of texturing, just outline each scale. And then the next step would be to add the highlights within each scale. And this can always be adjusted later. You don't have to think about necessarily how it's going to look as a whole. You're just trying to think about the individual scales. And once you get the individual scales all colored, then you can think about the overall dragon, adding highlights and shadows to the outlines themselves for extra depth. These scales aren't looking the best, thankfully. I had spent hours doing this side just so you can see how it should look or how it could look as a final result. I can briefly go over some of the other texturing aspects of this dragon if you're curious. Have a look at the eye and you can see that it's got some depth to it and I've got lots of different bright blocks in there and I covered the whole thing with glass because I liked the glazed look that it created on it. The belly is very straightforward because we just have ridges that we carved, so we added some texture through the shape itself, through the form, and then I just took the darker blocks and put them in those cutout portions and then just made a basic gradient from dark to light, and you can just paint it on each section. And for the wings, those ones I did a little differently. I actually used a combination of painting by hand and the lighten brush. If I zoom in, you can see all of the different blocks it's using. I did not hand pick those colors at all. They were all kind of added through the lighten brush, and then I went back and cleaned them up and just kept the ones that I thought looked the best. I'm not going to go in great detail in it, but here's a very quick demonstration. You start off by painting the wing with just a base block. I'm using polished blackstone for this. And then I will create a lighten brush, which would be /BR, sphere, lighten, and then a size. And then I would gradually work my way through this. And it's going to generate a lot of random blocks in order to create this lightness. And the longer you go, the brighter it gets. So you just kind of have to know when to stop. I'm accidentally going over my gold too. But this is just an example of the black portion. That's generally how I got that lighter look. You can go in here and see all of the random blocks that it's placing. So on the other wing that I did, I went back and I replaced all of these ores with something different. I got rid of all of the concrete powder just because I generally don't like building with it, unless I can have a block underneath of it because I just don't want to risk it falling everywhere. But you can see all the different blocks that it's placing by using this brush. So I did a combination of that, but then going back and cleaning it up by hand, removing some things, also hand painting some darker sections. If I go back to the side, you can see I made it bright in the middle, but I also have these streaks going next to the bone structure. And that's again just helping to reinforce that form that was already existing, but the colors here are helping to reinforce that. Thank you all for watching. Once again, these are my own personal ways of texturing these very specific things. That doesn't mean it's the only correct way to do it, but I hope you found these tips helpful in some way. Have fun building, and I hope to see you later. Bye!